St. Peter died around the year 64, and as you probably recall, they were intending to crucify him, and he insisted that he be crucified upside down because he didn't feel worthy to die in the same way that Jesus died. But he was very willing to give his life for the good of the church and for Christ. St. Peter's the most interesting of all the apostles. He's one that we can certainly relate to. Peter, the most wonderful experience he had, two experiences he had. One was the day that Jesus called him to be his disciple, apostle, and said that he would go on and become fishers of men. And he left his boats and he followed Jesus. He was called. And he knew something very special about Jesus. The other time was the transfiguration, when he was transfigured before Peter, James, and John. Jesus appeared dazzling white as he would after he rose from the dead. It was a great experience for Peter. He saw Jesus raise a young girl from death to life. He was present with Jesus at the Garden of Gethsemane when he was agonizing so much. He was the one who cut off Malchus's ear as a kind of jerk reaction to Jesus being arrested. But then he was the same man who at the Last Supper told Jesus that he would never deny him. And right after that, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he told the maidservant that he didn't even know the man. When Jesus caught his eyes, he went out and wept bitterly. He was so sorry. And he's the one who Jesus chastised so greatly when he took exception to the fact that Jesus said the Messiah would have to suffer and die. And Jesus said, no way, I'm not going to let that happen. And Jesus strongly says to him, get behind me, Satan. You think like man does. You don't think like God does. And yet, he also said to Peter, it was not you who chose me, it was I who chose you. And so go forth and bear fruit. And he said to him that it was my Father who gave you the faith to believe in the resurrection of the dead. And he said that it was not, he would not build the church, but Jesus would build the church. Those were very strong lessons for St. Peter and for us too. We have to have that kind of trust in God that Peter eventually had. And you and I think it says something about the very simple fact of holiness. Peter was a holy man, but he sinned. He failed Jesus a number of times. But he always came back, and Jesus always forgave him. And Peter began to realize that he was weak and that he could do nothing of his own, but with God's help, all things were possible. And then he went forth and just proclaimed the gospel to the Jewish people like no one else could. St. Paul was similar. He died around the year 67. And we know Paul's story. He was persecuting Christians, killing them. And of course, Jesus knocks him off his horse one day and says, why are you persecuting me? In that terrific encounter with Christ on the road to Damascus, he began to realize that Jesus truly was the Messiah. And from that day on, he began to preach just that. And St. Paul became the greatest of all preachers and the author of a good portion of the whole New Testament. St. Paul suffered a great deal for Christ. As he says in some of his writings, that he was shipwrecked, he was imprisoned, he was nearly drowned in the water. People beat him to death, they imprisoned him. He went through all kinds of terrible things. But he said that it's when I am weak that I am strong. In my weakness I find strength because Christ supports me in whatever I'm going through. He received that tremendous grace that you and I should have too, to realize that God doesn't cause problems for us in our life, but when they do occur, the Lord will be there not to just take them away, but to help us work through it, to live through it. So Peter and Paul are always, their feast is celebrated together, because of the tremendous effect they both had in spreading the gospel. Peter to the Jewish people and Paul to the Gentiles. There's a beautiful basilica in Rome called St. Paul outside the walls, and it's a basilica dedicated to Peter and Paul. And what is for us is to have the kind of humility that Peter had to know that we must trust in God for all things. And he says in the scriptures that those who do will be rewarded with eternal life. And so that's where we're all heading, aren't we? To eternal life in heaven. And so we have to take each day as it comes, offer it to the Lord, and like Peter and Paul, be a sign of God's presence to the world.